Okay, so we all know the image, right? The classic Viking picture, long ships, cutting through the water, all those bearded warriors swinging axes around. Maybe they even have those horned helmets, even though we know those weren't really a thing.
Right, right.
But they're like, the briggers of chaos, right? Raiders, pillagers, just this super violent force. They really represent that whole early medieval period. But today, you and I are going to dig into that a little deeper.
Yeah.
And we're going to ask, was their reputation for being so ridiculously violent, was it actually true? Or is there more to the story when you look at, the bigger picture of everything that was going on back then?
Yeah, you brought a really interesting article to look at today from Live Science. It's called "Were the Vikings Really That Violent?" And it's a great place to start figuring all this out. I mean, the goal here is to kind of move past that popular image of them and figure out, all the nuances. How did their violence actually play out in their historical context?
Exactly. It's so easy to just get caught up in all the stories, the sagas, just filled with these epic battles and these, warriors who just seem larger than life. But we need to look past all the myth and legend and figure out what the reality actually was. So, how did what they were doing compare to everyone else in medieval Europe? And who wrote all these accounts that shape how we think about them in the first place? And what does the actual archaeology tell us? Did the digs back up what the stories say?
Well, the article gets right to the point. Daniel Milano from the University of Denver, he says straight up, they were absolutely violent. I mean, there's just no denying that.
Right.
But the next question, and the one that people often forget to ask, is, okay, they were violent, but was it really that strange for the times?
Yeah,
I mean, were they super extreme, or was everyone else kind of doing the same stuff?
that's a really good point. It wasn't exactly a peaceful era across Europe, was it?
No, not at all.
I mean, Molino even points out that the whole Viking Age, roughly from 793 to 1066, it happened right in the middle of what he calls, an already violent time.
Yeah.
So wars and enslavement and just raiding each other, that was already the norm. It wasn't like the Vikings invented all of that.
Right, exactly. You can't just look at what the Vikings were doing without thinking about all of that other stuff that was happening, too. You have to see the whole picture. And I think something that made them seem even more intense, maybe even scarier, was how mobile and adaptable they were. Think about those longships. They were game changers.
Oh, yeah.
Super fast, maneuverable. They could just pop up anywhere along a coastline or a river. Nobody was safe.
I could imagine just the terror of seeing those ships appear out of nowhere. One of the most famous early Viking raids was on the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793.
Right.
And a lot of people actually think of that as the real start of the Viking Age in Western Europe.
Yeah, Lindisfarne is a great example. The article talks about how monasteries were prime targets. They were unwealthy, they didn't have good defenses, and they were important symbolic places. And this is where it gets interesting, I think, because it shows how people thought about Viking violence, especially with the whole religion angle.
Yeah, that's a good point, because you had the Vikings who, at least at first, were pagans following Norse gods.
Right.
And they were attacking mostly Christian communities. So the accounts we have of the Viking raids, most of those were written by the Christians who were being attacked.
Of course.
And they didn't just see it as being robbed. It was way more than that. Caitlin Ellis from the University of Oslo, she emphasizes how the Christians saw it as an attack on their whole faith. They used words like heathens and pagans to describe the Vikings.
Right, right. And Ellis points out that some Christian writers, they actually thought that the Viking raids were like divine punishment. They saw it as God punishing them for their sins by sending the Vikings to attack.
Wow, God was using the Vikings to teach the Christians a lesson. That adds a whole other layer to how people were interpreting what was happening.
Yeah, for sure.
And it makes you think about how biased some of the historical accounts might be. It makes you wonder whose side of the story we're really getting.
Exactly. And that leads us to another big problem in understanding Viking violence. What kind of historical record did the Vikings themselves leave behind? It's really different from what I see in Southern Europe at the time.
Oh, yeah? How so?
Well, the Vikings didn't really write much down. They had oral traditions, they told stories and passed them down that way.
Right.
They did leave runic inscriptions, but they didn't write down long histories like other cultures did. So most of what we know about them comes from either their victims, who obviously had a very strong point of view,
Well, of course.
or from those sagas, which were written down centuries later by their descendants. And as Milano says, of course, the victims would focus on the violence they suffered.
I mean, that's just human nature.
Exactly. It's a totally natural reaction, but it definitely shaped the story that gets told. It's like only hearing one side of the argument, you know?
Yeah, it's like reading a news story where they only interviewed the people who were attacked. You don't get to hear from the people who did it, or even from anyone who was just watching. So you're getting a very specific viewpoint, and it's naturally going to be negative.
That's a good analogy. And Ellis has another interesting point. She suggests that those negative portrayals of the Vikings, that they might have actually become more exaggerated over time.
Really?
She says that some of the most brutal, terrifying descriptions of them, those come from sources written in the 12th century, and that was centuries after the main Viking raiding period had even ended.
Wow, that's a huge gap.
Yeah.
I mean, that leaves a lot of room for the stories to change, right? To get more dramatic, more scary as they were told and retold. And the original fear and trauma, they could be amplified as it's passed down for generations. So you have to wonder how much of what we think we know about the Vikings is really based on what people saw with their own eyes, and how much of it is just, storytelling.
Exactly. And this gets to what Milena was saying about how some of the historical accounts just don't add up. He uses the town of Dorstad as an example. It's in the Netherlands. And a chronicler named Prudentius, he says that Dorstad was completely destroyed by the Vikings multiple times, like in rapid succession, 834, 835, 836, and then again in 837.
4 years in a row?
Yeah, so you have to think, if a town gets completely wiped out like that 4 times in a row, there wouldn't be much left to destroy, would there?
Right, it just doesn't seem logical.
So then Mileno looks at the archaeology, and he says that we don't usually find evidence of that kind of widespread destruction. Like, you'd expect to find mass graves and huge burn layers across whole settlements if the written accounts were accurate.
Right.
And he doesn't see that. So that raises the possibility that some of the accounts from back then, they might have exaggerated how bad the raids actually were.
So maybe the stories were more about scaring people, demonizing the Vikings, than about telling the truth exactly as it happened. It's like propaganda in a way.
It could be, but it's important to remember that the Vikings weren't the only ones doing this kind of stuff. The article makes a point of saying that they weren't the only group in Europe that was using violence at the time.
Oh yeah, that's right. There are other groups doing similar things.
Exactly. The article mentions the raids by those Muslim groups. They were called Saracens a lot of the time,
Right.
and they were active in southern Europe. And then you had the Magyars over in Hungary. They were also raiding and pillaging and causing chaos all over the continent.
And we can't forget about what the established kingdoms were doing either. Like the article talks about Charlemagne
Oh, yeah.
and his long wars against the Saxons. I mean, he was using some pretty brutal tactics too. Mass executions, forced conversions, taking tons of hostages, and a lot of pillaging.
Right. It wasn't a peaceful time to be alive, no matter where you were.
Definitely not. And building a kingdom back then, it often involved a lot of violence. Which leads to an interesting distinction that Mileno makes. He talks about the difference between what he calls Viking raiding and Frankish wars of conquest. And he says that maybe the difference was in how the violence was organized. The Vikings, they weren't part of a formal kingdom, at least not at first.
Right.
Their violence was kind of, well, I don't know how to put it, like more for the ground up. Whereas with the Franks, it was more top down. What do you think about that?
I think that's a really important point. So you have the kingdoms like the Franks, and even when they were fighting wars and doing violent things, they were doing it with a kind of official authority. They had a government, a structure, so their violence was part of that system. But the Vikings, especially early on before they started settling down and forming their own kingdoms, they were outside of all that.
So the people they attacked, they didn't see the Vikings as representing a country or a king or anything like that.
Exactly. And Mileno says that because the Vikings weren't part of a formal kingdom, their victims probably saw them as more unpredictable
Right.
and maybe even more barbaric, like they were operating outside the normal rules of warfare. He even compares them to pirates.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Because pirates, they're not following any laws or answering to any government either.
I never thought about it that way. It's like if your village gets attacked and burned down, I mean, the experience of that is going to be awful no matter who does it.
Oh, absolutely.
But how you think about it later, how it gets written down in history, that could be really different depending on whether it was a king's army or a Viking raiding party. Like, if it was a war, then there's a reason, there's a purpose, it's official. But if it's a bunch of Vikings, then it just seems random and chaotic and maybe even more terrifying.
Exactly. And for a long time, the Vikings didn't have a state or a kingdom to be held responsible for their actions.
Right, there was no one to punish or to make peace with. So that probably had a lot to do with why they got such a bad reputation, a reputation that we're still talking about today.
Right.
So it seems like the reality of Viking violence, it's way more complicated than just those simple images of bloodthirsty warriors that we see everywhere. I mean, they were definitely a powerful force, and they did some terrible things.
For sure.
But they were operating in a world where violence was already the norm, and the historical sources, well, a lot of those were written by the people who were victims of the Vikings, so they're not exactly neutral. And then the fact that the Vikings didn't have their own state for so long, that probably made them seem even more scary and barbaric to the people they attacked.
Exactly. And we talked about how the stories about them might have become more exaggerated as time went on, and how the archaeology doesn't always match up with the most dramatic descriptions. And most importantly, they weren't the only ones being violent in Europe at the time. There were lots of other groups doing similar things.
It really needs you to think twice about all those Viking stereotypes, doesn't it? I mean, yeah, they were a force to be reckoned with, no doubt about it. But maybe their reputation for being uniquely bloodthirsty, maybe that's more about how history's been written than about how they actually were.
I think that's a really good point, and it brings up something important for everyone to consider. We've been talking about how a lot of history is written by the people who are most affected by events. The winners, the victims, the people in power, they get to tell their side of the story.
Right.
But that means that our understanding of other historical groups, it could be shaped or even distorted by the evidence that's available and by the perspective of the people who left those records for us. It makes you wonder whose voices are missing from the stories we tell and how that might change our understanding of the past.
It's a good reminder to always think critically about history and to question everything. Just because it's written down doesn't mean it's the whole story.
Right.
There's always more to discover.